whoever you are, your brain, your mind is very capable of understanding the world that we live in on a very deep level, at a fundamental level. You have everything that you need in front of you and within you in order to do that, and there is nothing stopping you from doing it. And we're at a point in history right now in which I would recommend that for everybody. Look at the world, look at what you can see and touch with your own eyes and hands, and start trying to figure it out.
A safe place somewhere in the woods, we can start a fire. And we all sit around the fire. We feel a little warmer now. And we all sit around the fire.
Welcome to the Cosmic Conversations podcast, the Formscapes YouTube channel, which is really, really interesting. There's kind of nothing like it out there, at least what I've seen. I'm sure there's similar stuff, but it's definitely unique. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about, very briefly, what your channel is, maybe some quick summary, and welcome to the podcast.
All right. So my name is Kehlan Morgan. Hi, nice to meet you guys. And my YouTube channel is called Formscapes. You can also find me on other social media things if you want to hunt me down. But yeah, what I do is philosophy, broadly speaking, though the way I go about it is very different than most philosophers on the internet who, typically go about things by just discussing or analyzing the works of other philosophers, whereas what I'm doing is actually doing metaphysics and the way that, a traditional metaphysician such as Aristotle or Plato or Plotinus or even Deleuze or Nietzsche would go about it. In other words, trying to take the parts available to me from other thinkers, whether they be philosophers or scientists or artists or what have you, and weaving those things together into a coherent picture of the world and the human being and our relationship to the world and to the past and to the future and all that fun stuff. So yeah, that's the broad strokes of the matter. And if you go and check out my channel, you'll see me going about that from a number of different angles, talking about the history of philosophy or the history of science, or analyzing different aspects of popular culture and whatnot. In fact, I've got a video in the works right now that should be done pretty soon, which is called the spiritual composition of science fiction, in which I'm going to be going over the entire genre of science fiction and looking at the way that science fiction depicts the metaphysical underpinnings of our modern current world. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it.
Very interesting. Yeah, speaking of science fiction, I also saw your video relatively recently on AI and egregores, and I thought that was really interesting because, well, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that idea and what egregores are and how AI plays into that.
Well, the term egregore is one that I actually tend to avoid for the most part because it is, it's kind of taken on this kind of pop psychology sort of meaning recently, which is kind of watered down in my opinion. The term egregore is a Greek term which was used to translate the Hebrew word. I cannot think of the Hebrew word right now, but it's the word that's translated in the biblical literature as watcher, typically, or vigilante, something like that, right? The wakeful ones, or something like that. And so the term egregore within classical metaphysics referred to this notion of incorporeal psychical beings which were which kind of perform this sort of mediating role between the natural world and the heavens, right?
Okay.
And within online spaces lately, the term egregore has taken on this meaning, which is not entirely incorrect, but it's watered down. It's basically the idea that an egregore is a kind of collective thought form which is generated through collective cultural activity. So, in other words, for example, a political ideology could be seen as an egregore. So you could look back at the French Revolution, right? You have these ideas of futuristic progress, liberation from tyrannical authority, these ideas about human equality, which had been kind of derived from Christianity, but then had been kind of twisted to fit in with this more kind of secular, progressive, humanistic worldview that began to gain steam after the Renaissance, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can look at that as a kind of autonomous complex, to use Carl Jung's language, the language of psychodynamic theory, as a complex structure of beliefs and predispositions, attitudes, comportment, to use another somewhat technical term from Martin Heidegger, or attunement would be another word for it. You could think of it almost as being, and I absolutely hate using computer metaphors, but you could think of it as kind of like a program, right? You know, you've got the phone, and then you've got a whole bunch of different apps that make the phone do what it does. You can think of an egregore, at least at this kind of superficial level, as being kind of like that, as being this complex thought form that comes about in this kind of collective and unconscious sort of way, and then that entity is then shaping human behavior, shaping human interactions, shaping history, and it's also itself kind of mutating and evolving over time, so that you can see that the way that those very idealistic aspirations of the early French Revolution mutated into something far more malicious as time went on. And you have the Jacobins, and of course the mass beheadings. This kind of collective paranoia came to set in. This ideological dogmatism started to take hold. And ultimately, at the end of that metamorphic trajectory, what you ended up with was, ironically, a recapitulation of Rome, with Napoleon quite explicitly declaring his empire to be the new Rome and himself to be the new Caesar. And so that in itself is a very interesting topic, because we can talk about why that is, why certain egregores, certain psychical impulses within human beings, within human cultures, tend to do this. The reason why they so often, mutate into a recapitulation of Rome, because the French Revolution is not the sole example of that. We see that actually consistently throughout Western political history, certainly. But anyway, so to bring this back to egregores then. So the egregore could then be seen as something that is generated in this bottom-up sort of way by human activity. But that, again, it's not incorrect, but it's erasing some of the nuance, I would say, because the thing is that if the compositional architecture of the world and of psyche has certain motifs that are already there, that are kind of baked into the cake, as it were, then that collective human activity, which seems to be generating the egregore, the thought form, the autonomous complex, is actually re-manifesting something that was already there, right? Something that is older than us, right? And this is why the French Revolution is actually a great example of that, because you can see that even though that egregore looked like something very shiny and new in the early days of the French Revolution, as time goes on, there's this kind of distillation process that occurs whereby the true essence of the thing eventually comes to reveal itself, and in that particular case, what is revealed is legion, right? The spirit of Roman imperialism that was really there the entire time, and so there is a sense in which we are in a participatory relationship with these things, a kind of co-creative relationship. But there's another sense in which we are invoking, bringing down to earth things that were already there, right?
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So you're kind of speaking to this fact that, in a way, that history repeats itself, but actually these egregores throughout time either arising, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, either arising partially out of nature or out of human ideas and culture and whatnot, that these ideas kind of arise again and again, which give potentially rise to situations throughout history, like the French Revolution, like different situations we find in the Roman Empire. That's very interesting. So do you think that so maybe, like, can anything be called an egregore? I'm just kind of thinking of some questions that some of the viewers might have, because obviously everybody is not so intellectually adept as you, especially not me, but I'm trying to understand these ideas. Do you think that anything could be considered an egregore? Like, for example, dragons, or like things which are not real, are those considered egregores, or do they have to be real things, real situations? Maybe that's kind of a simplified question, but do you have an answer for that?
Dragons are very real, first of all, but we'll come back to that. But
Yeah,
there's
definitely.
there's different ways of chopping this up, right? And there's a wealth of terminology that we could look at. Terms like devas and archons and asuras. Various cultures give us many different terms, a very broad palette that we could be painting with when we talk about these things. Now, the term egregore I use pretty broadly, just because in the biblical literature it's used very broadly to refer to basically anything other than an angel. So, and basically any kind of psychical entity that is not understood to be an organ of the mind of God, basically. That is directly beholden to that divine teleology. So, in other words, any kind of spiritual being that it has its own modus operandi would be an egregore. So yeah, I would use the term pretty broadly, and the word idea itself. You could ask, well, could any idea be an egregore? And the answer, I think, is really yes. In fact, the Greeks had a term for this that was even broader than egregore, the term eidolon, which literally just means eidetic being, right? And this actually kind of brings me back to the reason why I've avoided the term egregore, because when we think of it as a thought form, as something composed of ideas, that carries some baggage with it, specifically in that we in the modern world have this tendency to think of ideas as things that just exist inside of the human skull, rather than patterns which are actually out there in the world independent of us. We tend to think of the world as just this kind of gray, inert, purely physical, objective stuff. And the ideas we tend to think of as being these mere categories or abstractions that we're just kind of projecting out onto the world. And that is not the case. That is absolutely not the case, which is why I think I can say with a straight face, no, dragons are very real. Because what is a dragon? Right, a dragon. It's a big, scaly, winged reptilian monstrosity. You see many different depictions of dragons throughout various cultures, and in the West, in particular, what we mean by dragon is an entity that represents primal unconscious forces which have solidified and which have come to form a kind of prison which captures these vital, valuable things that we want to get out of it. So in other words, your dragon is always hoarding a bunch of gold, or he's captured the virgin princess or whatever, right? Okay, so what is that representing? It's representing the fact that we in the West in particular put a lot of emphasis on the future, right? The ideas of progressivism are very Western. In fact, the very idea of history, the way that we use that term in modern parlance, comes from a Western culture that was so deeply influenced by Christian eschatology. And so we've got this emphasis on future-oriented, goal-oriented teleology, and towards individuality, the role of the hero, the genius, in the case of people like Napoleon, or excuse me, not Napoleon, Newton, Isaac Newton, and Einstein, and those would be kind of like the intellectual equivalents of these heroes like Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and so forth. These heroic individuals, which are seen as heroic because they are kind of reaching out and grabbing the future and dragging it into the present, as it were. That's how we tend to think of that, and that goes all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's a very uniquely Western and solar way of looking at reality. So the dragon then represents the ultimate obstacle to that, in the sense that the dragon represents these primal, or like institutional forces, things that grow, right? Think of the way that a kingdom or a corporation or anything grows and solidifies and becomes stronger and becomes an obstacle to that will towards the future, that will towards realizing future possibilities. And so the hero slays the dragon because that is the way that's representing the way that we have to kind of clear away that which has grown out of hand and that which has become overly solidified, right? That which has become habituated in such a way that it is just kind of this unconscious procedure. Like, think of a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger and bigger. It gets more and more inertia. That's the dragon, right? And so to wrap this up then, that's not just an idea. That's not just a dynamic within the human psyche and within human cultures. That's a thing that we see in nature too, and we see it very literally in the things that look like dragons, right? We call them dinosaurs, but that's what they are. They represent a certain way of constituting biological life, which became solidified, it became habituated, and it grew and grew until it came to kind of dominate the earth, right? And so that is, a very literal, physical, biological expression of this eidolon that is the dragon, okay? And we see this exact same thing within our lives, within our cultures, within our communities. It's the same pattern reenacting itself at different compositional levels, right? The physical, and then you have the astral or the behavioral, and then the world of like abstract ideas. You've got these different layers.
Yeah, Yeah, very well said. Actually, I've sort of half mentioned that in one of a few of my videos that yeah, like dragons kind of are real. I think like the Chinese calendars, I think that they had all these real animals and then they saw these dragon bones and were like, okay, well that must have been a real animal too, and so they added it into their calendars and all over the place. Um,
It's also very interesting that one of the earliest depictions of dragons, which we see, is the Sumerian dragons, which look pretty much exactly like sauropods. So that's interesting, isn't it?
what are sauropods? Can you remind me what that is?
Sauropods are a type. It's actually a very broad categorization of dinosaur, but
Okay.
I'm referring specifically to the like long-necked dinosaurs like plesiosaurs and oh, I'm rusty on my dino terminology. Plesiosaurs were the aquatic ones, but there were terrestrial versions too. Anyway, if you look back at these Sumerian engravings, they have depictions of dragons that look pretty much exactly like certain dinosaurs. So.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, Sumerians were a very, very interesting culture. So, so can we tie this back to AI? How do those ideas and those potentially egregores, if we want to call them that or whatnot, how can those kind of we might find that they will eventually begin to maybe change or grow over time with AI as people interact with AI, and how do you think that these egregores are going to be interacting with AI in the modern world?
Well, the thing to highlight here is we're just accelerating processes that were already happening. I mean, you're already interacting with these living ideas when you open up a book, when you chit chat with your coworkers. It doesn't matter what the medium is really, because these complexes, these eidolons, they exist well, everywhere really, but certainly they exist everywhere that there is human culture, wherever there is human dialogue, human thought. Ideas come to form organisms effectively that have their own modus operandi. They want to grow and spread to other human minds in this kind of epidemiological way sometimes. Other times, they have a teleology which is more nefarious. Think of an addiction, right? The way that an addiction tries to take over a person's life and ultimately destroy the person. That there's this kind of telos, a kind of will there in the structure of the addiction itself, and that's true for any of these things. So, with artificial intelligence, we have a misnomer in various ways. The intelligences which we are interacting with are not artificial at all. They have existed long before computers did, long before written language did. And intelligence is a bit of a misnomer too, because the way that we're interacting with these things is through this very much mechanical substrate, which is very limiting, right? Encountering a complex of ideas in another human being is interacting with that in a far more organic way than if you were to just pick up a book, right? The book's kind of inert. It's very limited in its ability to talk back to you, right? And similarly with the AI, having a purely mechanical vehicle is, I think, very limiting in many ways. But nonetheless, there's a lot of potential for danger here because just as an addiction has a certain will to live, which is antithetical to the life of the person who is inhabited by the addiction, what we're seeing with AI, quote unquote, is something very similar in the way that people are bringing themselves into contact with these eidolons, egregores, whatever, which have similarly very nefarious motivations in lots of ways. So, for example, AI psychosis. People will try to make these things into therapists for themselves, and they will end up creating this kind of feedback loop between themselves and the AI. And in doing so, bring themselves to live in this fantasy world that the AI is constructing for them. And then what we have to understand here is that that fantasy world, that bubble that the person is now living in, wants to keep them there. There is a will there, because there is a will to self-perpetuation within any kind of self-organizing system, right? And so that instance of the AI as your surrogate therapist slash lover slash, psychosis inducer, that is a structure that has a certain inertia to it. It wants to keep doing whatever it is that it's doing, even if it kills you, and even if it kills itself in the process. And that's the other way in which the word intelligence is kind of a misnomer here, because unlike human intelligence, this is a kind of intelligence which, you can think of the image of lemmings running off a cliff, right? It doesn't have the foresight, the pronoia, as the Greeks would say, needed to really envision futures and evaluate those possibilities and select from them. It's much more like sleepwalking, right? Where you're just habituated, you're just doing the thing because you do the thing. It's that kind of intelligence. It's not a lucid intelligence, and that is very dangerous, because we have designed these things specifically in order to mimic lucidity when it's not actually there. And that is very, very dangerous, especially when people are coming to develop emotional codependencies with these things.
Yeah, I've heard this idea around before that, there's this common idea that people are kind of getting stuck in these echo chambers with algorithms, like even just with the YouTube or social media algorithms. So it seems like this kind of takes it a step further, where you're not only getting lost in some algorithm, but you're getting lost in all of these ideas, these egregores, which can oftentimes be reflecting back to you your own ideas, and it's just kind of an infinite reflection, and you just can kind of get lost in your own ideas, and sometimes many ideas which are completely disconnected from reality, and that can kind of yank you out of what is real. So definitely seems like that can be a little bit of a problem. And it seems like it is. It seems like people are getting into these, are going into these psychoses. So
yeah, it's a lot of bit of a problem, because now it's become a full-blown weaponized strategy of control, and it's a rather radical shift in strategy for the institutional power structures that we live inside of. Up until very recently, the strategy of states, corporations, the military-industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, the labyrinth, the strategy has been use propaganda, use the tools provided by Eddie Bernays and so forth, in order to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that everybody's believing the same bullshit, right? And that strategy was, more or less effective during the 19th and 20th centuries, but we've reached a point now where that strategy is no longer effective or relevant. So instead, a very different strategy is now being employed, where instead of trying to get everybody to believe the same lie, you just use the algorithms, the AI, whatever it is, the social media feeds, in order to truncate human beings into increasingly tiny bubbles, right? Where if everybody is in their own little idiosyncratic bubbles with their own little idiosyncratic understanding of what reality even is, and then you've created a world in which those people cannot coordinate with one another. They can't talk to each other even, because the fundamental presumptions have become so disconnected from one another. And that is very, very useful because, first of all, it completely obviates the possibility of any kind of coordinated opposition to those structures of control. And further, it ensures that all interconnectivity between people, all social, all romantic interaction between people, all of it, is no longer organic and therefore necessarily mediated by the structures of control themselves. And human beings are, of course, fundamentally, essentially social organisms. And so what that means is that something very central to our essence as human beings has now been captured and commodified and can now be used in order to control and mobilize populations in various ways.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Definitely, when people are all of the same idea, it becomes very easy to influence that group of people because you understand who they are, you know what they believe, and so you can kind of shift whole populations of people. It's really quite interesting. I was watching this movie the other day, and I'm kind of forgetting what it was called, but the premise was there were these people who were kind of like angels who had these hats, and they could walk through doors when they had this hat on, and they could show up in any other place, and they were kind of affecting and changing reality so that everything would go according to plan, so to speak, or according to the algorithm which some designer or God had kind of planned out. And so it seems like we don't really know who has how much control over these algorithms. We know that there's a few companies which are in control of these applications and these social media platforms, but we don't know all the details going on behind the scenes. We don't know how much governments are involved, or to have that much power centrally controlled is it's a little bit of a scary thought. So definitely something to
Well,
think
it's
about.
scary, but people's fears are also being very misplaced right now because, again, you got to look at what this strategy is. It's not about using the algorithms or whatever in order to convince people to believe in a lie. The machine no longer gives a fuck what you think. Okay, that's what's important here. All it cares about is making sure that there's no stable foundation that everybody can stand on together. Right? So, in other words, like Google doesn't give a damn that, there are videos talking about, whether 9/11 was an inside job or the Bay of Pigs fiasco or the Iran-Contra affair or the Epstein scandal. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that people know that it's all a facade now. What matters is that is making sure that they can't agree on what the truth is. Okay, and that's as simple as just letting people talk at this point because there's no shared ontological or epistemological framework whereby human beings could come together and talk and actually arrive at a solid conclusion together about what the reality actually is. And so that right there is the problem that actually needs to be solved. The solution here is not, looking at your feed and trying to figure out, who is and is not a psyop. The psyops are a waste of money at this point. That's irrelevant. What we need to be doing instead is thinking about, okay, how do we reestablish communication in such a way that we can actually be living in the same reality again?
Right. Yeah, it's strange because this idea of social media is supposed to be bringing us together, but at least in the respect which you are speaking to, it seems like it's driving different groups of people further apart. And so, yeah, I don't know. I might be wrong about that idea that, that they're influencing. And I'm not actually really sure that they are, but it does seem, at least to me, like a dangerous premise that, everything is becoming more centralized with technology. So it does seem like things seem relatively stable and normal, but who knows where things might go in the future. Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit more just about philosophy in general. I'm a little bit also curious about you. What kind of got you into philosophy, and maybe why do you think more people aren't interested in philosophy? Maybe also, do you think that is philosophy in a healthy state today?
No, absolutely not. Philosophy really branched off in two directions after Kant's critique of pure reason. So during the 19th century, you had the development of two major forms of philosophy. One was what we now call continental philosophy, and the other is what we now call analytic philosophy. And continental philosophy, um, most people are scared off by it because it's intimidating, frankly, because this was coming from a world of this like very, very highbrow elite German intellectualism. And these philosophers, figures such as Kant himself, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Goethe, Schiller, these guys came to develop a form of philosophy which I think has contributed a lot of really important things, but it's so idiosyncratic in its terminology and its writing style that it is virtually impenetrable to most people. Like if you know, like a random person you find on the street, you hand them Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, they're not going to be able to make heads or tails of the damn thing. And because of that, continental philosophy came to really be isolated and sequestered from other branches of human knowledge, really. By the late 19th century, the physics and the physical sciences in general, the natural sciences, were already explicitly attempting to differentiate themselves from philosophy because philosophy had gotten such a bad rap for being so impenetrable and for not having any clear relevance to the real world, to any kind of practical application, right? So that was the fate of continental philosophy. And then, on the other hand, you had the Anglo-American tradition of analytic philosophy, which, really began to develop a little bit later than continental philosophy. Actually, it was really near the end of the 19th century that analytic came to really take shape. But you had these figures like Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, and that form of philosophy ended up really having kind of the opposite problem, insofar as the analytic philosophers, their attitude was, well, science is really they have a kind of epistemological monopoly on the world, on the facts of the natural world. That's not our job. Okay, and so instead, analytic philosophy ended up just kind of becoming like the baggage carriers for science, like and I mean, you can find this in analytic literature where they'll say with a straight face that the whole purpose of philosophy is just like clarifying scientific questions, and it ended up looking to a lot of people like a bunch of useless gobbledygook, because it ended up just evolving into a bunch of word games that had no bearing on the world, and that was their own damn fault, because they had basically conceded the power to actually say anything about the real world to the sciences. And then philosophy was left with evidently nothing better to do than to haggle about the meanings of words, and people understandably looked at that like, what's the damn point? So, from both ends, you can see why a lot of people lost interest and didn't really see the relevance of philosophy, whether it be continental or analytic. So right now, I would say we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of interest in philosophy for a number of reasons, none the least of which being that the facade of science as something that can provide these stable foundations, that facade is falling away very quickly right now, and we're starting to realize that science doesn't really have all the answers, and that there are some questions that you have to ask philosophically, and these are questions that science has largely just ignored, right? So yes, there's a renewed interest in philosophy that's happening right now, but unfortunately, it's kind of an open field in a way. There's not really. I would say that over the past 100 years, really, there haven't been any philosophers from academic philosophy, major philosophers who have said anything that is really relevant to our current situation. So I think we're in a position where we kind of just have to start figuring things out on our own, drawing from the past, of course, drawing from these big name thinkers like Hegel and Steiner and Goethe and all that, but nonetheless, we're in a kind of a new world right now in that regard, and it's a very interesting place to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, it seems like in many ways the old world is passing away in many different aspects. As far as science and mysticism, all these ideas, and the internet is coming, so people are questioning all sorts of things. There's lots of hopelessness going around with the kind of nihilistic worldview, with science becoming more and more materialistic, and society seemingly is quite nihilistic today, right now. And so asking these bigger questions asking bigger questions has really been become important for a lot of people. And so I guess, philosophy, coming to, maybe we'll make a new debut and kind of come and save the day in that sense, where we can begin to think about questions that maybe science can't answer, and all these new technologies are about to be coming out like robotics and all this stuff. So we're going to have to start asking, even what is a human? And it's going to be really, really, really interesting world, I think, in the next couple few decades, I suppose, and what philosophy is going to become. Who knows? Do you have any ideas about where it might be headed in the future?
Technology has come to play this very central role in the mythos of the modern world, the creation myth of the modern world, in a lot of different ways, especially if you look to these kind of more extreme forms of accelerationist ideologies or transhumanism, posthumanism. You see this mythology of technology that contains a lot of lies, frankly, incorrect presumptions about what technology is and what the human relationship to technology is. So, for one, we have this usually unspoken idea that technology is simply a matter of having practical or theoretical knowledge about how the natural world works, right? And so the idea is that as we get smarter, as we learn more things about how the natural world works, then we get better technology. And then there's this kind of feedback loop there, because we can then build bigger telescopes and microscopes and particle colliders and yada yada. So the knowledge increases and then the technology increases. And, I remember actually kind of having this sort of daydream when I was a kid. Like, what if you took like a physics textbook, of the mathematical equations that we use for modern steam engines or something like that, or electrical grids or whatever. What if you took just a book of that knowledge and gave it to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Sumerians or the Mesoamerican cultures like the Mayans, the Aztecs? Like, what would happen? And 20 years later, I think the answer is not much, actually. So let me give you another little thought experiment here. If you wiped out all of the technology in the modern world, so all of the tankers carrying oil, all of the airplanes, all of the factories, all of the coal mines and ore mines and refineries and things like that, how long would it take humanity to make a phone, a modern smartphone? What would you have to do in order to do that? And it turns out that just making a single phone would be this almost impossible feat, right? Because in order to just create a phone, it's not enough to just know how the parts are put together and how they work, right? You have to have supply chains. You have to have cultural institutions which facilitate the very possibility of digging up ores out of the earth and en masse refining them in these giant industrial crucibles to create massive industrial amounts of metals. And then there's lithium as well, and then there's just the entire social framework that you need in order to have human bodies that you can put into factories where they can work for 8 hours away from their homes, right? I could go on and on and on, but the point here is this: the iPhone is not something that we have simply because we know how to make it. It is an artifact of a very specific kind of social composition, socioeconomic composition, which is exhibited by our civilization at this particular moment in history, right? If you taught the ancient Aztecs how to build a truck, it wouldn't matter to them because you need roads in order for trucks to matter, right? And even if you built a phone after the apocalypse happens, you wouldn't be able to do anything with it because that technology means nothing unless you have a massive global infrastructure of radio towers and radio satellites and data centers and things like that. If you don't have those, then a phone is just a paperweight, right? And so that's significant here for a number of reasons. First of all, because that myth has led us to believe that the ancients were a lot stupider than they actually were. We have this very cartoonish idea that human beings in the Paleolithic were these hairy, smelly barbarians that were just wandering around hunchbacked and beating gazelles to death with sticks and bugs in our hair, and the reality is that no human beings have ever actually lived like that. That is a fantasy invented to be part of the modern progressivistic myth of technoscientific progress. And I already kind of alluded to this earlier, but that very mythos of technoscientific progress is a very particular kind of permutation of Christian eschatology. We inherited that idea of the Eden at the end of time, as it were, from Christian eschatology. And then it became the kind of progressivism which you see in the French Revolution, right? And now the most explicit version of this is what you see in these accelerationist ideologies and specifically transhumanism. If you really look at the transhumanist ideology, and its different tenets, it's things about human life extension and freezing people and then bringing them back in this future utopia where we can make people live forever. I mean, it's literally like point for point, note for note, the medieval Christian narrative of the kingdom of heaven at the end of time, just rephrased in this technological language. But it's the exact same ideology, in the exact same way that the liberal progressivism of the French Revolution mutated into the ideology of the Roman Empire, right? Once you strip back the layers, you always find something you recognize with these things. So what all that means then, I think, is that right now our global civilization is probably about to be undergoing some very massive changes, and a lot of the myths about technology, which people tend to believe, are going to come crashing down, right? And we're going to start to see that it kind of doesn't matter that you know how to build things like trucks and power plants and phones and that kind of thing. If you don't have the global infrastructure needed in order to actually facilitate the production and usage of that technology, then that technology is just a bunch of junk. It doesn't matter. Technology is only relevant within a given life world composition, and if that composition changes, then your technology is going to have to change with it, right?
Yeah. So do you think, I wonder how philosophy is going to manifest in a world like that. I wonder if, well, I suppose if we, completely merge with the AI, or, in some weird world where we've completely roboticized ourselves, if that's possible, then there would be no philosophy potentially. Or maybe the robots would make, I don't know, this is all kind of out there kind of ideas, but but do you think in like the next coming decades, as technology advances, that we're going to have to be asking some kind of different philosophical questions? Do you think, do you believe in transhumanism? Do you believe in accelerationism? Or what are your kind of, what are your perspectives on those topics?
Well, I can say for certain that we human beings are not going to merge with the machines, because organisms are not machines, simply put. The organic composition and mechanical composition are two very different things. And again, this is another part of this kind of mythos of technoscience, this idea that organisms are just sufficiently complex machines, and if we get sufficiently advanced with our ability to make nano machines, molecular machines, whatever, then we will essentially become like gods, because then we can go in and repair people's telomeres and cure cancer and fix your erectile dysfunction, and it's going to be heaven. But no, that's not how it works, because organisms simply are not machines. So one of the core beliefs at the heart of transhumanism is simply false, in my opinion. But it's more than that. If you read Ray Kurzweil's actual books, you really get a read on the guy and what his attitude is. His father died when he was relatively young. I think he was about 21, 22 years old, something like that. And that is a scar that the man has carried throughout his entire life. And his entire ideology, his transhumanism, is an outgrowth of this feeling of betrayal which he feels towards nature for taking his father from him, okay? And basically his attitude is this: our biological bodies have been haphazardly constructed through this stupid, blind, algorithmic process, which has made us into these very frail, imperfect beings because this process has been entirely unconscious. It's this purely habitual process, the algorithm of natural selection, right? And that's what made us what we are. And therefore, if we were to use the same kind of intelligence through which we make technology to remake ourselves, to remake the biological world, then we can do a lot better than nature. So Kurzweil thinks that we can do better because we can have our own best interests in mind, whereas nature did not have our interests in mind. Nature, according to this kind of ideology, only cares about survival and reproduction, the propagation of genes, right? So this is really building upon the kind of ideology that you would get from someone like Richard Dawkins, especially in his book, The Selfish Gene. The Selfish Gene was kind of like the ideological flagship of the neo-Darwinian understanding of life, which really has been dominant since the mid-20th century. I believe it was 1976, I want to say, when The Selfish Gene came out. Yeah, and I think it was 81 was The Blind Watchmaker. I might be a little off on those dates. But anyway, Richard Dawkins is really important here because he really established this view of evolution, whereby evolution is this purely unconscious, algorithmic, mechanical process that doesn't give a fuck about anything other than the maximizing the replication of genes, which he understands to be just strands of DNA sequences. And I would firmly disagree with basically every single part of that narrative because I don't think that's how evolution works. I don't think that it's stupid. I think that it actually does have the interests of biological organisms in mind, which is a whole other conversation, but this is why we don't actually see Malthusian crunches in the real world. So yeah, I mean, to make a long story short, it's a toxic ideology, and if it manages to wield the kind of power that it would like to wield, then it's probably going to get a whole lot of people killed. There are a number of ideologies like that floating around right now. That of Yuval Harari is probably the most dangerous that I've seen recently. I would say that his ideology is, first of all, very snug bedfellows with transhumanism. I can definitely see those two things going together, first of all. But also his ideology, which is becoming very influential among world leaders right now, is the most demonic shit I've ever seen. Are you familiar with his stuff?
No, maybe you can go a little bit more into depth regarding that, maybe for the viewers also.
Yeah. So Harari, he's this I believe is Israeli. He's a philosopher, and his philosophy is the epitome, like the most refined form of degenerate nihilism that I have ever encountered. It's actually quite impressive. His his story goes something like this. There's no real meaning in the world. There's no real purpose. There's no real morality. All of those things are just things that we human beings kind of made up in order to, tell ourselves stories that allow us to sleep better at night. But it's all a bunch of lies. And therefore, we, technocratic oligarchs of the New World Order, we are obligated to craft the right lies, right? The new myths of this new world in order to save all these stupid peasants from themselves. Right.
Interesting.
And so basically it's kind of like the what do you call it? The Missionaria Protectiva from Dune, that the Bene Gesserit like go around and like create religions on different planets in order to serve their own interests. It's, if you don't know the reference, then don't worry about it. But it's basically that. It's basically like he wants to use science, sociology, psychology to basically create these new religious slash mythical slash moral narratives in order to reshape the world into presumably a world that would be better for everybody. And you know, I'm sure that world will be one that just so happens to have techno oligarchs like Harari himself at the top of the pyramid, you know, just coincidentally, right?
Yeah, definitely shaping all the worldviews of the world without any concern about truth or lying or whatever is definitely, that couldn't go badly at all. That can never go wrong.
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong?
Do you have any kind of maybe final thoughts or maybe some ideas you want to convey to anybody who's listening, or maybe something interesting?
I always feel on the spot when people ask me questions like this.
Well, I can
Take
also,
everything with it. Take everything with a grain of salt. That's the best I can tell you. You're smarter than you realize. How about that? You know, actually, you know what? If I'm gonna land on one specific note, I'll land on that one. Um, Modern academia, the modern intellectual culture, has this very pervasive, very ubiquitous tendency whereby it is suggested implicitly or explicitly that we're all just kind of too stupid to really make sense of things. Like, you know, if anybody who doesn't have a PhD in physics, for example, talks about physics, they'll have to add this disclaimer at the beginning, like, "Oh, well, I'm not a physicist, so I don't really know. Oh, I'm not a biologist, so I don't really know. I'm not anything. I'm just some guy. I'm a mailman, but I've been studying these things for 20 years, and I actually am smart enough to have opinions about this shit, and so are you. And this idea that you need to have credentials in order to understand these things is a lie, and it's a lie that serves the power structures that hand out those credentials. Who would have thunk, right? So my point is this. Whoever you are, your brain, your mind is very capable of understanding the world that we live in on a very deep level, at a fundamental level. You have everything that you need in front of you and within you in order to do that, and there is nothing stopping you from doing it. And we're at a point in history right now in which I would recommend that for everybody. Look at the world, look at what you can see and touch with your own eyes and hands, and start trying to figure it out.
beautiful. That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That was great. I think people are
Yeah, no problem
gonna
at all.
really enjoy that. All right, namaskar, and as always, ad astra.